low student satisfaction. If South Australia does this, it will have missed the opportunity to use its funds to create new, nimble, custom-made colleges and study centres. It will have created instead a lumbering dinosaur, dependent on an outdated business model driven by international student fees, and which assumes that cross-subsidising research is just going to go on forever. South Australia would be locked into launching in 2026 a giant that by then will be quite out of step with the changed university environment in Australia. So my recommendation to the committee, unquestionably, is that the upper house should recommend to government that this legislation be postponed for at least a year until the Accord legislation in Canberra is clear, by which time I suspect the government will have quite a different view of what it should do. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Questions from members?
Yeah. So you're suggesting that we wait and then merge?
Look, can I just say a word about mergers? Mergers are a very powerful tool for universities where you have an area where there's been rapid population growth, and so you've got a vast number of students who can't get in, find a university place. This is what Dawkins did. He very rapidly did a whole string of mergers which very rapidly solved the massive problem we had in the late 80s of the majority of young people not being able to get into universities. And I mean, we moved from university study being a kind of elite pastime of a minority to a mass system. And that's what it's for. The biggest of all university mergers worldwide, which is the creation of the California university system in 1960, had the same objective. A massively expanding population in California, huge numbers of students left behind, and it created an enormous network of additional places for them. Now, South Australia doesn't have this problem. There's not massive growth here. The demographics are quite flat, and demographics can tell us what's happening 20 years from now. The school leaver figures have been steady for years. So this is the solution to a problem South Australia does not have. So do I think then we merge? I think no. I think there may be a merger of something. I suspect you'll have a much more loosened idea of what's next.
Do you think, though, with the current administration of the two universities, that they've come to this conclusion that they should combine and form a new university? Are they making that with all the information that's available to them, or are you suggesting that you've got access to more information than them and they should wait because of that? Or?
Well, I mean, all of us, including those Vice-Chancellors, I assume, have only learnt in the last 3 weeks from the interim report what's ahead. And in good faith, I'm sure they've done what they did, but the ground rules are about to change, and I think we need to pause and wait and see what happens.
So we'll hear from them next week. They're both coming in, the Vice-Chancellors from the two universities are coming in. If they are comfortable that they can manage the changes that might come through this and still be able to do this at the same time?
Well, look, David Lloyd, who's now the chair of Universities Australia, made a very good speech about the Accord reforms to the National Press Club yesterday. So, yes, you probably should engage with them about whether this affects their thinking.
Thank you.
Honourable Sarah Gain.
Thanks very much for your submission, which was really informative. I'm just hoping that you'll be able to help us understand, and me in particular, it's been argued to me that despite the fact that when we look at international examples, it's often smaller universities that are very high performing and high ranked and attract good quality researchers, we really need here in Australia to have large universities to give ourselves the best chance of attracting high quality research, growing, and being a high-ranked institution. What's your response to that?
Well, the key rankings are a measure of research. Let's remember that. And what makes the great research? What makes the great research is world-class researchers. The addition of one Nobel Prize winner to a campus is worth $100 million. Just that one, because that changes the ranking. And I mean, at the University of Melbourne, we saw this during the pandemic, when the Nobel on staff ended up with a major role in developing the vaccines that brought that pandemic under control. His presence was worth more than $100 million. Now, did it have to be in vast size? It wasn't. It was in his labs with a few people. So I don't think large and ranking are necessarily the same thing.
And can you give me your opinion on whether a larger institution, do you feel that there's a risk with larger institutions that the teaching quality and the student satisfaction would be reduced?
Oh, it always is. In Australia, most surveys you'll see that the largest universities do least well in the quilt, which is the measure of student satisfaction. The smaller ones do quite well.
Do you feel there's an argument that perhaps it's not necessarily all about ranking, but that Adelaide University finds itself financially in a situation where it feels it needs to merge to secure its future?
It certainly isn't all about rankings. And, rankings is one of these evils we've had to live with. I remember once when I spent some years recruiting students as a dean and meeting a family in Malaysia who weren't considering coming to Australia. They were going to a particular American university campus, and I said, "Oh, why would you do that?" Because law is what they wanted to study, and I was at Melbourne University. It was a world-class law school. Oh, well, it's ranked 40th in the world, except the university they were looking at didn't teach law. So, the misunderstanding about ranking is profound, but unfortunately, international students, they read the rankings, and that's how they make their choice. Unhelpful though that may be.
Thank you.
Connie Benares.
Thank you, Chair. Professor, pardon my ignorance. I understand you were with Adelaide University between 2012 and 2017, is that correct? What discussions took place during your tenure, if any, regarding mergers between the universities in Adelaide?
Well, when I was appointed, there'd been in the background discussions of mergers. When I announced my retirement, they began again.
And during that 5-year period, given that they predated and they post-dated, were there ongoing discussions during your tenure around a merger?
No, but I recall, I think it was 2015, there was a meeting convened by the Premier of all 3 Chancellors and Vice-Chancellors, and at that time he was proposing, it wasn't terribly clearly articulated, but a merger possibly involving all 3. And at that time it was turned down by all 3, and so nothing.
So your position then in 2015 when that was raised was that it was not something that you supported?
I mean, anyone who followed my career as Vice-Chancellor would know.
Yeah, yes, and again, pardon my ignorance.
I haven't been a fan of mergers.
Right,
No.
okay. So this is the starting premise then that regardless of the outcome, you're not supportive of mergers in South Australia?
Well, I mean, it depends what it is, you know. I mean, the Victorian College of the Arts merged with the University of Melbourne, and I was acting dean of the VCA for part of that period. Now, the outcome of all that, at long last, has been very productive. It took 10 years. There was 10 years of staff departures and student protest, and, it was a terribly turbulent time. But it's certainly true that in that case, the outcome was really good. But these sort of enormously large-scale mergers, I just could never see what
the point
really
was.
What the value was, and I've read all the material about this one.
And it's been someone help me with the maths, what is that, 6 years or so since you've left 7 years
Yeah,
since you've left.
Yes.
And I think we can take from what's been presented to us that there's been a great deal of ongoing discussions regarding a merger over that period of time. Would you agree with that?
Well, there was an attempt, the whole thing was reanimated in 2018 and then again failed, but certainly this time it's got a lot further.
And do you think that, and there was certainly some evidence this time from was Ms. Locker who actually presented evidence, who talked about the internal politics and so forth that existed at the time, and she was involved in that process as a board member. But do you think that this proposal may be more rock solid or better placed, given that a lot of those underlying issues that have been referred to in evidence appear to be addressed, and that regardless of whether they have or haven't, there is an enormous amount of work that has gone into this proposal by both universities. We've also heard from Flinders who, on the face of it, don't have an objection to the proposal. So we effectively have 3 universities saying, regardless of what's in that report that is released, this is what they've determined is in the best interests of South Australian universities. Do you think that is something that we should just dismiss, or do you think that is we should acknowledge the level of work that's gone into that planning?
I think if I was Colin Sterling at Flinders, I'd be really quite unfussed about this. I think this leaves him very well positioned. The university is an excellent size. It's doing fantastic research. It's got first-class outreach in the Northern Territory and across the state. And I imagine he wouldn't feel the slightest bit worried about this. I'd be very surprised if he supported the merger, though, because certainly in discussions in past years where I was involved with him, he was not a supporter of the merger. But yes, there's been a lot of work go into this. I can't say, I've read the vision statement and the transition plan. I can't say, though, that I'm very illuminated about actually what this is.
And do you think that might change if indeed this committee or more broadly we had access to further documents which built on that transition plan that you refer to in terms of backing in the proposal?
Well, it's just that, if you were to ask me what this is going to do and what impact it will have, I would say I can't tell, because the vision statement, it's not a picture of a bold, fresh new university. It's a collection of generalisations and peppered with repeated references to size and to ranking and to equity matters. I just can't see what the picture is.
And I appreciate that, Professor, and I think there's a desire amongst all members of this committee to have access to, more meat on the bones in terms of fleshing that out. But if that meat on the bones effectively stacks up in terms of satisfying us or otherwise of whether the merger ought to go ahead, then do you think it is appropriate for us then to make those deliberations on the merger, regardless of what you've said about the Accord review?
Well, I think I would doubt it, because it would appear that the way this has proceeded is unlikely to reach the end you describe. Manchester, which is, and I'm not opposed to all mergers, Manchester was a fabulous success as a merger. And the foundation vision statement for Manchester in 2004 was very sharp, very well focused. The founding Vice-Chancellor had a very clear idea, 9 principles of what he was going to do. First, beginning by recruiting a little group of world-class researchers, Nobels and high-sci researchers, knowing that they would draw in outstanding students, and then he set particular targets. Now, and he also quite fearlessly announced which of the fields in the 2 universities he was going to give critical mass to because they were world-class, and which would fall by the wayside. Now, the thing is, though, that Alan Gilbert, the founding Vice-Chancellor, was brought in completely from outside with no baggage in the previous two universities. It had been arranged for the two existing vice-chancellors to retire, and then he was appointed to plan it. And he arrived 8 months before the opening day, so he had 8 months to advocate his 10-year Manchester 2015 vision, which was just inspirational. Now, in fact, what we've got here, as I understand it from the transition plan, is very different from that. Instead of appointing a founding vice-chancellor and asking him for the vision, there's going to be rotating co-vice-chancellors for 3 years, including a year beyond the opening of the university. So I think the vision statement to me reads not like a vision. It reads like a very carefully worded compromise between two competitors, which of course is what it is.
And herein, I suppose, lies the dilemma for us as members of this committee and also for this parliament. And I'm glad you used that example because yesterday or the day before we had Professor Hamner appear, who I think it's fair to summarise, painted the Manchester example as in the complete opposite light. So something that should have cost $300 billion ended up costing 300 million ended up costing 1.4 billion. If you want an example of why not to merge, then Manchester is the example that you should be looking at.
Yes, look, what happened at Manchester, yes, what can we say about that? It gave the northwest of England a world-class university, which the two it had had were not and would never have been. It made a fabulous impact, but in the end, partly for economic reasons, the downturn and so on, it cost £1.3 billion by the fifth year. So the question with Manchester has always been, was the benefit worth the price?
And we can't rule that out here, one way or another, at this point in time, can we, about the benefit for South Australia if we're talking about creating a university town and being in that top 10 elite university towns across the globe? We can't rule that out, that we might have the same result here in South Australia.
Well, I mean, if I read the Premier's early statements about this, the ambition was to create not the top 10, which is, I mean, you realise the top 10 universities never
They were
moved.
my words.
Yes, because that's, Oxford, Harvard, Cambridge, Stanford, I mean, they never change, the top 10. But the ambition was to have South Australia a top 100 university. It's already got one, by any measure.
Thank you. And just finally, just going back to that accord, and thank you for your indulgence, Chair. Just finally, on the issue of the Accord review panel, is there any way that you can see these two issues, the merger proceeding and that process coexisting?
Well, can I answer that slightly at right angles? Of course, we've got a Labor government here and a Labor government there. I'm sure the Labor government would want to see the Labor government here supported. But the head of the Department of Prime Ministers and Cabinet is Glenn Davis, who is a former senior Vice-Chancellor of two universities, long-serving and very, very respected Vice-Chancellor. He recently wrote a very seminal article called Why Are Australian Universities So Large? And it's very clear that he's very closely aligned with what the Accord wants to do. So will the Accord report end up in legislation? I think it will, because he is in an enormously influential position. And if that ends up in legislation, I don't think they're going to stop a state from doing anything it wants. I'm just saying I think it would be unwise to think, once we see all of that legislation, that this is a particularly good idea. I think South Australia will want to do other things.
Thank you.
Member for Morehouse.
Thank you. And the matters relating to the Accord I thought were really interesting, and I think it's a lot more depth in that matter than the committee's got into so far. I might come back to questions about that a bit later. I'm still percolating. One question I've been asking to most of the witnesses who have expertise in this area is in relation to what I think the Premier has described as sort of the twin pillars of opportunity for this University of the Future, being outstanding world-class research, which obviously, as you described, leads to improved rankings, and we've seen as a positive the draw that might have on international students. And at the same time, the Premier has argued that an enhanced student experience, enhanced opportunity and access for students in South Australia to a high-ranked university is a good thing in itself. I think those twin pillars have been described often in the House and in the public by the Premier. We have had some witnesses suggest that it's very difficult for a university to be best in class at research and best in class at student experience, vocational outcomes and satisfaction. I think you talked about large universities struggling with the QUILT survey before the Quality Learning and Teaching survey. So I guess I'm wondering the ambition that the state government has and the Vice-Chancellors have for a new institution to be nation-leading, world-leading at both research, reputation and also student experience. Is that possible? Is that feasible? I think one of the witnesses talked about the University of Newcastle as having a very strongly rounded perspective on that.
So can they be great at teaching and research?
Can they be world-leading at both?
Yes, yes. Look, that's a very difficult ask. I think I'd be with witnesses who told you that that's very, very hard. The world-class research emanates from a world-class researcher and his or her lab. And if you deal with these kinds of researchers, you know they need small teaching loads, they need time to spend just with their assistants working on their projects, and the measure of what they do is the research outcomes, the grants they get that make those outcomes possible. They don't get out of bed to talk to students, really. Whereas the outstanding teachers, that's what gets them out of bed in the morning, the excitement of explaining concepts to students and the thrill they get in the students' faces when they know it's understood. And the measures of the researcher are the rankings and the grant figures. The measures of the teacher are those exceptional QUILT outcomes. Now, can you have a university that does both? Look, can I answer it in this way? One of my problems with the vision is there's not a single specific example of how this would benefit any field of teaching or research. Not one. Now, if I give you an example of the challenges that are ahead of us at the moment, climate change is an urgent matter for all educational institutions. We're told within 10 years we need 135,000 people working in renewable energy. Now, who's going to train them? And how would they be trained? By the time a big comprehensive university goes through its course approval process and all of its review requirements and eventually gets a degree up. I can remember years ago when in Melbourne University the government wanted a particular specialty of IT graduates. It took us 4 years to get the course up and another 2 years to buy the equipment, and by the time we were ready to go, the need had passed. So, but we got to do this quickly. Now, probably the way you get those people trained is not by merger. You work out amongst your universities a little network or a collaboration that can quickly put on the kinds of courses they need. But meanwhile, climate change also means particular kinds of research in geoscience, for example, finding us an emission-free jet fuel. There's reflecting solar energy back into space to lower the heat. The carbon neutralisation of the soil, iron fertilisation of the oceans. These are fields that are still very speculative, but very, very urgent. Now, then you've got the bulk of the students, who are all, I must say, way ahead of us with all this. They're all animated about climate change. They're dying to study climate science, to study energy, to study conservation and the things that go with that. Now, okay, so some universities could get the star researchers in geoscience and in those specific fields that need to be dealt with if we're to get anywhere with climate change. Some other universities might be able to put on the sort of undergraduate courses in climate science that are desperately needed. You might have study centres or little short-term providers who will come up with the training for those 135,000 people we need in the next 10 years. But can you do all of these things in one university? I doubt it very much. It's a very tough ask to be world-class in teaching and research.
So I guess what I take from some of your testimony there, but also others, is that research in Australia is not funded to the full value. If somebody gets a grant, then that covers a portion. The university must make up the rest of its funding. So if the university wants to focus on research, it must therefore draw those resources from other places, and in the reality has been that's largely international students or Australian students teaching. And the question, I guess, from your experience at Adelaide, Melbourne and other universities then is that a fair summary? There's a transaction that if you want to invest in getting that high quality research with small labs who are enormously expensive, then that must draw people in who aren't going to be sharing the teaching load. So the money, there is a prioritisation that a growing pie doesn't necessarily get eaten fairly by everyone. Is that a summary?
Yeah, yes, and look, you've touched on there about the funding of research, which is a very big problem, and in the interim report of the Accord isn't yet dealt with very much. And now you've mentioned universities I've been with. Melbourne University, of course, is privileged to be enormously well endowed, so it's able to fund some research from endowments. But most other universities have been doing it by cross-subsidy, and certainly the Accord talks about transparency, that universities are doing that are going to end up with it in the figures and very obvious to the students what they've done with their money, and it's going to become less sustainable. So, change has to come with research funding, and certainly at the moment, that's a real challenge for the whole sector.
One of the propositions in front of us that I personally find most interesting is the suggestion by the government of having a $200 million research fund. The government's proposing it be for the new institution. Others have suggested it could be shared with Flinders as well. But the key point is the state government investing in a perpetual fund to have $20 or $30 million of state research investment. And I understand that would draw some extra federal investment as well. I can imagine what your answer might be, but do you think that there is merit in the government considering pursuing this as a policy goal of investing in research, irrespective of whether or not a merger goes ahead?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I think that was a wonderful announcement, that's part of what the government plans to do. I wouldn't have thought Flinders would be terribly excited about it, of course. And, the point is we've got here 3 mid-sized universities, each of which have great merits. And a fund like that, I would have thought equity demands it be open to all 3. So that's the bit I don't understand. But is it a good idea? Yes, absolutely.
In your testimony, you talked about the VCA and that merger, which, as I understand it, was a large institution merging with a very small institution. And we've talked about Manchester. My take on Professor Hanmer's evidence was that he was very much focused on the financial implications of that. I think he acknowledged that there's been some benefits down the track, but there was a great cost, and the transition challenges, I think, have been longer and more difficult than expected.
Yep.
But I think he also said that the scale of that merger was also smaller than either of our current universities. So are there any successful mergers that you're aware of internationally or at state level that we can learn? Like if we were to proceed with the idea, things that we can learn, what works in a merger? What are some of the positive opportunities?
Yeah, well, look, I think the profession would probably agree that the most successful of all mergers worldwide was the creation of the California university system in the early 1960s. And that is certainly something we can learn from. One of their challenges was to get economies of scale and educate far more of their population, which they did. But that wasn't the most interesting thing about it. The most interesting thing, I thought, was how they defeated the challenge of equity and access. They arranged the universities, the public universities in California, into 3 tiers. And the school leavers, the best prepared of the school leavers, the top 12%, were given free places at the University of California. The next group, who had school completions but not so outstanding, all got free places at California State. And then the equity groups, the disadvantaged, the minorities, the adults who'd never had a school completion, for them, a group of new 2-year community colleges was created, specifically to give them the preparation they didn't have, with a guarantee that at the end of that, they would go in to either UC or California State. Now, it was perfectly obvious to any student where in that system they belonged, where they should enter, and how then they could use that system to complete their preparation and then shine as a university graduate. Now, that was done in a very large scale, and I certainly think we can learn from that. But the other thing about the California merger, which is, I imagine, the most distinguished of all, and the reason that system was then emulated in some other states and also in other countries, was what happened with the interaction with business and research. They gave each of the campuses specific missions where, the world-class concentrations were then, given first-class research leaders to get better and better. And then the postgrad students were incentivised to create startup companies around what they were doing. And so, from this great concentration of IT students and staff who'd been sensitised entrepreneurially, we had the birth of Silicon Valley. And not only that, but around the bioengineers and the scientists, important European pharmaceuticals and biotechnology companies opened offices around those labs. And so the concentrations of research were then suddenly, there are the business people as well. And it acted like a magnet for business investment. So over time, these things, the benefit to the state of California, to the Californian economy, was staggering, lifting the state economy of California to world leadership amongst economies. Now, that, of course, was an enormous scale. I'm not saying that, every Australian state can have Silicon Valley, but we can learn from that, because in a small way we could start that right here too.
Well, I guess that leads me into a lot of the benefits proposed for the merger are the opportunities for a new university to engage more successfully with business and industry than our current institutions have. I heard your testimony before saying there's no detail yet, and obviously we're hoping to see more detail as to why that claim is made. But those arguments that we could, well, do you accept that there are arguments that a new university could more successfully engage with business and industry, as the proponents have suggested?
Well, the critical thing in the public universities of California had nothing to do with size. It was a decision to incentivise postgraduate students in prominent research areas to go out and do startups.
So that could be done with or without a merger?
You could do that in a university of 1,000. You don't have to have 75,000 to do that.
Can I just follow up? Because that's sort of different to what I've heard. I thought they were really beneficiaries of scale, and it's the biggest university in the world, isn't it? The California UC system over there. And that has been the benefits, and why they can, because of their scale, they can offer free degrees to people from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and they're one of the best in the world at bringing people from those backgrounds into. But they can only do that because of their scale.
Yes, it's a system though. It's not a single. You understand? It's not a single university.
No, that's right. That's right. but they can do that and they can specialise in Berkeley and UCLA and all that sort of stuff because they are big enough to sustain that high quality research.
Yes.
If they stayed small,
What the Chancellor of the system does is coordinate these things and happening, and it could be done here. The state government could coordinate further differentiations of the three missions of its three universities in particular ways, so that Flinders does this, UniSA does that, Adelaide does this, and greatly strengthen their appeal to the relevant industry.
they could do that if they're not competing with each other, I guess they can't.
Well, I mean, they wouldn't, they wouldn't, that's the point, you differentiate the missions, and this is what the Accord wants. It wants diversity. I mean, it's an unfortunate word to use, diversity, because they're not talking about what we mostly understand about by diversity. They're talking about a diversity of types of universities. So the future ought to be three quite different universities here with quite different aims and developing quite different strengths.
So, absent the changes that seem likely under the Accord, do you have a view on the impact of a merger on South Australia's economy and student opportunities? I know your testimony is that the Accord is likely to take place, but it hasn't taken place as yet. So under the current arrangements, what's your view on the merger?
Well, as I said, it's just difficult to say what the impact will be, because this is so generalised and so unlike what you normally get for the initial vision statement of a university, pair of universities that's about to merge. It's just very hard to tell.
We've talked, this is probably my last question, we've talked a lot about how there are claims and question as to whether there's evidence for those claims. The flip side of that coin is, and I've talked about a lot, is that there presumably might be risks to merger, and I'm interested in understanding better from government and universities what are the mitigation strategies, what are the risks they've identified, and what are the mitigation strategies that they have put in place to mitigate against those risks. As a former Vice-Chancellor, what are the sort of risks that you obviously identified in that role that we should be hoping have been considered?
Well, I think I've seen in the media that the NTU president articulating what I think is the major risk, and that is once you make this decision, there's no going back. And having lived through that VCA University of Melbourne merger, even when it reached its absolute rock bottom with demonstrating students and the best staff walking out, one thing that wasn't open to us was to put the genie back in the bottle. It's just very, very hard. I mean, once you shatter the students' view of the culture they're in, you shatter the loyalty of the alumni to a particular thing. I mean, there's just no way back. And so to me, that is the big risk. And I don't know how you ameliorate that, really.
And in that sort of circumstance, what does that do to the vision that's been put forward by the proposal that in 10 years' time we'll have a top 50 university and everyone will be beneficiaries of world-leading research and world-class student experience? The circumstance you just described, what impact does that have on the ideal outcome that's been suggested by its proponents?
Well, it will certainly take 10 years. I mean, if you do a merger, eventually a new culture does appear, but it is 10 years. And there's a lot of people sacrificed along the way. That part of my career was the most difficult, dealing with that at VCA.
And if people leave the university, so the rankings question, sorry, I said this before, this is my last question. The rankings question has been suggested that if you have the scale to afford more world-class researchers, bring them in, that'll lift the rankings. But we're talking about a combination of two separate universities. So I think it's been acknowledged by the government that you might see a dip in the rankings and then it'll advance. Is 10 years best case scenario, worst case scenario, or a middle of the road for the culture and the rankings to get to where they're hoped?
Look, I don't really have any experience from which I can answer that. So I haven't, I mean, at the VCA and University of Melbourne, we're in the arts with the rankings. not, they don't matter.
Maybe let me rephrase then. In terms of the VCA merger, you said there was the difficult time, and we're presumably now out of that difficult time, but that was a much more modest scale. How long was that difficult time, and
Well, I think it was 10 years.
for the smaller merger?
Yes, by the time a decade was over, you got students who knew exactly what they were coming to study in and were no longer aggrieved about the loss of something. And also the staff who felt their lives were shattered by it had gone, and you had new staff committed to the new to the new vision. So yes, eventually it worked out. But that was a very small example.
Honourable Jing Lee, and then the Honourable Connie Benares.
Thank you, Chair. Very similar lines of questions, sort of along the Honourable John Gardner, but I've sort of phrased it a bit differently. Reputation of any university is crucial, and it takes years and years to establish. So from a marketing perspective and perhaps an operational point of view, what challenges do you envisage it will be for the new merged university to reach the level of credibility to gain perhaps a competitive advantage that South Australia is looking for? Do you think it can be achieved? What suggestions do you have?
Well, you see, I can only answer that from my years as the Vice-Chancellor of one of these universities, and I can tell you for a fact that whatever reputation or marketing achievement there may be, the loss is going to be enormous. Because when we were recruiting in Asia, when I was Vice-Chancellor at Adelaide, all you had to do was put the crest in the Straits Times or whatever the local newspaper was and say the Dean of such and such a faculty will be here on such and such a day, ring here for an appointment. And they came because, over 100 years of history counts for something. And let's remember that university has had, over its history, more Nobel Prize winners than any other university in Australia. So what pains me is the loss of all that. And so that obstructs me from really answering your question about what next.
Honourable Connie Benares.
Thank you. Professor, just one more supplementary off the back of the Accord review, and I'm sure that's something we're all going to be looking at more closely. But surely the Chancellors and Vice-Chancellors would be aware of that Accord review process as you are, and that would have been, and I'm sure is, surely a primary consideration, notwithstanding that they've put forward that proposal. I mean, can you imagine a situation where the Chancellors have not taken into account the sorts of considerations around the outcomes and the very likely outcomes that you've pointed to in coming up with this proposal? Surely that, and we obviously can ask them this directly, but surely they must be as acutely aware of those processes as you are, and that has fed into their thinking on the merger.
But the interim report of the Accord's only been published for about 3 weeks. So they would have had to have ESP. And I don't think any of us knew until that report came. I mean, they've been taking submissions for months. But what they were going to do, I don't think was plain to anybody.
But we can't think for a moment that they went into this blindly. There are considerations which everyone probably might have thought are likely. But regardless, this would have been, ought to have been, you would think, still front and centre, that there might be recommendation A, B or C, and how does our model stack up against those potential recommendations? I mean, can you imagine a scenario where the Chancellors would not have hypothesised about what some of those outcomes might have been or are likely to be, and not thought about those in coming up with this merger?
I think you're making a pretty unreasonable expectation. I mean, the two Vice-Chancellors you're dealing with at the moment are highly intelligent people. They've had as much notice about what was coming as I have, which is a few weeks. And of course, I think they'll be thinking about it deeply now, and especially because of the depth and the specificity of the interim report, and then what's coming in December, which is the full report, I think they will now start thinking about these things very seriously. And if they're coming next week, you probably should find out from them where their thinking is up to. But I don't think any of us knew prior to 3 weeks ago what direction Marianne Kane and her panel would go.
But they did know that it was happening, right? So when they were putting their case together about do we proceed, they didn't say we better stop what we're doing because there might be some changes coming.
But there's been a federal project to inquire into universities about once every 2 years through my entire career. Most of them don't amount to very much. The stunning thing about this is it's going to change a 30-year template. It's going to be the most important reform since Dawkins in 1990, and I don't know that any of them could have anticipated that was coming.
For Florey and then the member for Moralton.
Professor Bebbington, you were talking before about reputation and your concerns about the reputation of the University of Adelaide being lost. I just wonder if you could expand on your personal experience about whether how important GO8 membership has been for the reputation of the University of Adelaide.
Well, I think it's been quite important, and I certainly played an active role in the GO8 while I was a Vice-Chancellor. But as I understand it, that membership is not threatened in the merger. As I understand it, the GO8 have said that the new merged university could remain in the GO8. So I don't know what's...
Was it your experience that membership of the GO8 has been a positive factor in the reputation of...
I see.
Rather the University of Adelaide, I guess.
Yes, look, my experience of it was more useful in negotiating with the federal government, because it was a block that they recognised was very, very research intensive and very influential about the national research future of the country. So it was more valuable there than it was in marketing or in... I doubt that most students would know what the GO8 was.
So with regard to reputation in terms of marketing, and particularly when it comes to overseas students, you think university rankings are far more important than, say, membership of the GO8?
Not for domestic students, don't read them. But for international students, yes, they read the ranking tables and make a decision. I'm going there because it's ranked X. And as I've said, sometimes, I'm going there even though it doesn't even teach or rank what I'm interested in.
So they're not so much interested in reputation or history or that sort of thing. It's all about the rankings of your experience.
Yes, it's a very blunt... I've seen that because I spent quite a number of years recruiting in Asia as a dean, and it's a very blunt instrument, and but it's got some status way up there that is, it's a kind of almost binary decision, yes or no, depending on the ranking. But you can have fabulous things going on in teaching and a poor ranking, and there are great American universities that are teaching-only universities who are not ranked because they don't do research. So, it's only a measure of research and of certain kinds of research. And then there's several ranking systems. I'm talking largely about the ARWU, which is the most prestigious of the rankings. The others, Times Higher and QS, they have some rather more obscure features that it's a bit difficult to get behind.
Thank you. Member for Moralton.
Really good segue into my last question, which is on purposes. So rankings are seen as a measure of research more than anything else, but also a useful draw for international students. We broadly think international students are good for our state, and we make money from international students. Universities fund other things with their money. I would suggest I'm as interested in student experience. Most people who interact with universities are students who are seeking to gain skills, knowledge, professional opportunities, and that's certainly also in the state's interest. Other members of witnesses have talked about what makes a university successful, what makes a university competitive, and rankings in the Quilt survey have been identified as proxies for those two sort of features. But I'm really interested when the university vice-chancellors have been considering that, they do so from the perspective of the university Our job is from the perspective of the state. So from the state's point of view, what do you think that the purposes of our university sector really need to be focused on?
Well, they need to be focused on the good of the state and what will contribute and enhance the state. But the experience of most students, which only extends to an undergraduate degree or sometimes even sub-degree, diploma or something else, scarcely ever impacts the research very much. So it is the quality of the teaching that leaves the students with their memories of university. And we know from repeated surveys what they really want, which is the personal interaction with their peers, with a tutor, small classes, and what they really don't want, which is massed lecture theatres and too much digital delivery. I mean, they love certain kinds of digital delivery, but not at the expense of the human interaction. So it's, there is, that's really what they leave the university with. It's funny, at an alumni function, I once was told by someone that why he was there was because he'd graduated so long ago that it was long enough ago for him to think it would have been a good experience going to university. So, and I'm sure we all have memories of universities, characters and odd things happening that don't necessarily speak to quality of teaching, but they do speak to the nature of the community. And it is a very special community when it's well done.
Thank you, Professor, for your evidence today.